A slate-colored dawn seeps over the Gulf of Alaska, smudging the horizon where sea and sky forget their boundaries. On this remote stretch of coast lies Portlock, a ghost town that locals call a place of quiet terror. Wind drags a low mist across the black-pebbled beach, and the tide exhales against jagged rocks as if the ocean itself remembers what happened here, long before the first outsider arrived. Native Alutiiq hunters whispered of a shadow in the forest, something that walked upright, left prints the size of a man's chest, and carried a silence heavy enough to bend the mind. They never gave it a name. They simply stayed away. In 1785, British Captain Nathaniel Portlock sailed into this inlet and found a coastline too generous to ignore. Salmon thick as spilled silver, timber stacked like a cathedral of spruce. He named the cove for himself and left believing he'd discovered a paradise. But those who tried to settle here after him carried back stories of sudden sickness and a dread that worked its way beneath the skin like frostbite. One Spanish expedition reported nights filled with untraceable screams and a vibration in the air that made their teeth ache. They abandoned their camp without a fight, certain something unseen had already claimed the land. Decades passed. Then in 1867, a band of Alutiiq families dared to build homes on this lush coastline. For a season, the village thrived. Fish smoked over cedar fires. Children played under endless daylight. But as winter pressed in, something began testing the edges of their world. First came the low moans drifting through the trees, then the thud of enormous steps that rattled the earth like distant thunder. Hunters vanished. Carcasses of freshly killed animals were found torn apart, the meat left untouched as if the intruder fed on fear alone. Survivors spoke of giant shapes in the fog, creatures whose hunger was measured not in food but in human terror. By spring, the village stood empty. Half a century later, in 1921, Russian-American fishermen arrived with canneries and mail routes, confident that modern rifles and the order of industry would tame the wilderness. They built neat houses, a school, a bustling salmon operation. For nearly a decade, Portlock seemed reborn, but the forest did not forget. One overcast morning in 1931, a logger named Andrew Clock failed to return from his shift. Searchers found his body hours later, head smashed, sled dogs dismembered. His heavy freight sledge hurled yards from where it had fallen. No bear leaves a scene like that. Weeks later, fisherman Tom Larson glimpsed something massive on the tidal flats. It stood on two legs, matted with dark hair that glistened with seawater. Eyes caught the dim light and held it, deliberate and knowing. He raised his rifle, but an invisible pressure seized him, locking his finger before the trigger. The creature turned unhurried and disappeared into the spruce. After that, disappearances multiplied. Gold prospectors, trappers, entire hunting parties. Sometimes bodies surfaced in the bay, gashed as if by claws too wide for any known animal. Other times, there was only the echo of something heavy moving through the timber. And then nothing at all. Families who once laughed at old legends now refused to leave their cabins after dusk. Children learned to measure the silence. When the seabirds stopped calling, everyone barred their doors. By 1950, the last residents of Portlock packed their belongings and fled overnight. Only a lone postal worker remained for a final week, listening as footsteps, slow, deliberate bipedal, circled the abandoned houses. Each night until even he locked the post office and vanished down the inlet. The tide pulls away from the black stones of Portlock, leaving tide pools that shine like fractured mirrors. Above them, the forest tightens into a wall of spruce and alder, a labyrinth of moss-dark corridors where sunlight rarely lands. In the decades after the town's evacuation, those woods became a magnet for the curious and the reckless. Hunters, loggers, and wandering drifters stepped into the hush and found it waiting. For them, the same oppressive stillness, the same faint vibrations underfoot, as if the ground itself carried a memory of pursuit. Local pilots who flew over the inlet in the early 1950s reported shapes that didn't match the treetops, quick flashes of something large breaking through the canopy, then vanishing before their eyes could focus. On windless days, fishermen anchored offshore heard an undertone in the air like a distant engine idling beneath the waves, a sound that left their stomachs unsettled and their compasses twitching. Some blamed the strange acoustics of the bay. Others quietly packed up and moved their nets miles down the coast. A decade later, an anchorage hunter named Frank Riley tried to follow the legend to its source. He set out at dawn with 2 dogs and a rifle, planning a simple 2-day trek. He returned before sunset, pale and shivering, his dogs whining as if they'd been whipped. He told friends he'd heard a low, pulsing hum that seemed to come from the trees themselves. The dogs froze, hackles stiff, then bolted without a sound. In that stillness, Riley said, he felt the sensation of being watched by something far taller than the spruces, something patient and precise. He left the woods before the second nightfall, certain that if darkness caught him, he would never step out again. By the late 1960s, Portlock's name had become a quiet dare among Alaskan bush pilots and trappers. 3 hunters set camp there in 1973, drawn by stories of trophy-sized game and the eerie thrill of sleeping, where an entire town had surrendered. That night, a storm rolled in without warning. They swore later that something heavier than the rain moved around their tent, deliberate 2-legged steps pressing the sodden earth. The oldest of them described a shadow that seemed to bend the lightning itself, a towering outline that loomed against the flashes but dissolved when the sky went black again. 5 years later, a different hunting party followed a set of oversized prints along a ridge above the old cannery site. Each track spanned nearly 18 inches, sunk deep enough to hold rainwater in a perfect mold of toes and heel. They trailed the prints through dripping undergrowth until the marks ended at a clearing, slick with trampled grass and streaked with dark stains they could not identify. No drag marks, no animal sign, just the abrupt halt of an unseen struggle, as though whatever left those prints had lifted straight into the mist. Skeptics came armed with simpler explanations. A rogue bear walking on its hind legs, subsistence hunters inventing stories to guard rich fishing grounds, or the creeping effects of isolation and fear. But even hardened trappers admitted that no bear uproots trees and replants them upside down, as some visitors later found along the valley floor. Massive spruces, torn from the soil with roots exposed like black nerves, stood jammed back into the earth, crowned first silent monuments to a strength beyond any known animal. For the Alutiiq elders, these weren't just accidents of wind or soil. They spoke of a guardian spirit older than the bay itself, a being that punished intrusion, that moved between the seen and unseen like smoke through a cracked door. They never claimed to understand it. They simply warned that Portlock was a place the living were not meant to claim. Even in modern times, the pattern continues. Fishermen in the 1990s reported sudden engine failures and unexplained echoes on sonar when they drifted too close to the abandoned shoreline. Hikers still vanish in the surrounding Kenai Peninsula without a trace, their last footprints ending at the tree line as though the forest decided where their path would stop. Visitors who stand among the rotting pilings of the old cannery describe a weight in the air that feels almost sentient, a hush that presses against the skin, subtle but absolute, like a memory of being hunted. They speak of a faint metallic scent, of birdsong that cuts off mid-note, of an ancient rhythm just beyond hearing, like a heartbeat out of sync with the world. Portlock remains empty, a ghost village where time folds in on itself, and yet each fog-thick morning, the tide carries whispers back to shore, not of what was lost, but of what still walks, waiting for the next soul bold enough to cross its threshold. The inlet lies quiet under a bruised sky, the tide drawing silver, threads across black rock as if stitching the past to the present. The cannery ruins stand like broken ribs, their metal frames streaked with salt and decades of silence. Yet the stillness here is never simple. Travelers who linger after dusk describe a rhythm in the air, a slow, uneven cadence that seems to reach from the ground into the chest, a reminder that Portlock has never been empty, only waiting. In the 1980s, a team of forestry workers surveyed the coast for potential logging routes. They carried modern equipment, radios, and the casual confidence of those who believed. Every inch of wilderness could be mapped. On their second night, they woke to the dogs barking at something just beyond the lantern glow, branches cracked, deliberate and heavy, moving in a slow circle around the camp. One worker later recalled that the sound wasn't like an animal blundering through brush. It was the pace of something choosing its steps. At dawn, they found no prints, only 3 trees snapped and twisted against each other like a barricade. Years later, a paramedic in Anchorage told of a strange encounter with an aging Alutiiq prisoner suffering a heart attack. The man lay motionless until the medic mentioned hunting near Portlock. His eyes flared with a terror so sudden it seemed to erase the years. He grabbed the medic's collar and rasped a single question again and again. "Did you see it?" "Did it follow you?" Guards pried him away, but his voice carried down the corridor like a warning carved into the air. By the early 2000s, satellite images showed the forest swallowing every trace of the town, but pilots still reported instruments flickering when they crossed the bay. Kayakers heard a low, subsonic tremor when the fog rolled, thick and almost musical, vibration that made their ribs hum. Scientists offered theories of infrasonic resonance, microseismic waves, the echo of distant surf. Yet those who heard it knew the sound did not come from water or wind. It came from presence. Even skeptics admit that Portlock resists simple logic. Bears do not uproot mature spruces and ram them back into the earth crown first. Weather cannot twist metal. Pilings into spirals or leave prints that mimic a human, stride yet sink a foot deep in permafrost, and fear alone cannot account for the way time seems to thin here, as if hours stretch and contract under an unseen will. The most unsettling reports come from those who describe a sensation of being studied, not merely watched but measured. One hiker said it felt like standing beneath a silent ocean, aware of something vast moving just beyond sight. Another, a seasoned bush pilot, swore that while flying low he glimpsed a figure on the shoreline, motionless and tall, its outline too precise to be a trick of the trees. When he banked to circle back, the shape was gone, yet the instruments in his cockpit flickered, as though a magnetic field had passed through the plane. Today the inlet remains abandoned. Moss covers the cannery foundations, and the forest has claimed the schoolhouse and homes. Yet the legend endures, not because of folklore alone, but because the land itself feels animate, a living archive of every footstep that ever trespassed. Elders still warn young hunters to avoid the valley where the mist thickens. Fishermen steer wide of the cove even on calm days, and travelers who camp within earshot of the old town often leave before sunrise, compelled by a pressure they cannot name. Whether the force behind Portlock is a rare predator, an undiscovered species, or something that bends the rules of nature, the pattern remains. Arrivals followed by vanishings, warnings ignored until they become history. It is a story written not in ink but in absences, missing people, silenced nights, trees planted upside down like exclamation marks in the soil. Stand on that shore long enough and you may feel it too. The hush that is not mere quiet, the pulse beneath the stones, the sense that the forest remembers you more clearly than you remember yourself. Portlock does not need to be seen to be believed. It waits, patient as the tide, for the next visitor who dares to listen.